Hello, welcome back to IGB100. This week we're just continuing on from week 7. This is week 8 with the FPS game. And this will actually be the final tutorial for the FPS game. So this week we're going to be looking into some UI elements, going to be putting some information on the screen so we can actually see a little bit more about what the game is trying to communicate, as well as setting up some game objective logic. So currently, whether we die, whether we win, it doesn't actually matter. We're not getting any feedback about that. We're going to set up some logic that will change some conditions so that we can work with us accomplishing our goals. We're also going to look into score saving using what's called the player prefs system within Unity, as well as a little bit of simple main menu scene management, so switching between a main menu and the game and vice versa. So let's start by setting up a health bar. Right now we can take damage and we can die, but there's no feedback telling us exactly how close we are to death. So selecting your UI, go to Game Object UI Slider. And we'll just double click on the slider to see where it is. We might just reposition that so that it's roughly about where we want it in the UI. And we can start by, let's rename that to health bar, and get rid of the handle slide area. So we don't actually want a thing that can be interacted with to slide this up and down. We just want the health bar details itself. Something to fix straight away is that in the fill area and fill, for whatever weird reason, Unity sets some values that are generally not what you want. So let's just make the left and right values of the fill area 0, as well as the width value of the fill area 0 as well. The fill we can recolor to be some kind of green color. The background color, we might make that red. So now when we go to our health bar and scroll the value up, you'll see that we have a nice green scrolling bar representing the amount of health that we have. In addition to this health bar, let's also add 3 text elements to our user interface. The first one is just going to be some kind of information regarding the enemies remaining. And we'll change that text to also represent that, enemies remaining. And we might make it white just to make it a little bit more visible. I'll reposition this now so it makes sense. I then just want you to duplicate this twice and change the name of the first one to be something like time remaining. Changing the text as well, time remaining. And the latter one being your score. Also with score. So just reposition those two. And we may need to tweak them slightly in the future, but for the moment, that'll be an excellent placeholder for the basic user interface stuff. Finally, we're going to add one more text element, and that's simply going to be a much larger text element that is going to be roughly in the center of the screen. So you may want to reposition the central elements of the text to be in the middle. We'll make it a bit bigger, maybe 30, and we'll just see how that goes. This is basically going to be blank by default, but it's going to be the game over text. So this final element, which is in the center of your screen, will be game over text. It's going to be blank by default. You can see what it looks like if you do put some text in it now, although we may have to make it just a bit bigger. So scaling it up on the width and height, we can see that some text can appear as you would expect, but blank by default. So hooking up these UI elements is relatively straightforward, but it is something that you do through scripting, usually. So the first element that we'll hook up, just as more of a demonstration purpose than anything, will be this health bar, the thing that we set up first. So opening your player script in Visual Studio, we are basically going to enter a line of code here that's going to adjust our health based on whenever we take damage. So we don't currently have the capacity to heal, so our health only ever goes down. For the moment, we can get away with putting a line of code here that is essentially just something to do with our health bar. To set that up though, we first need to make a reference to that health bar, and this can be done by making a public slider health bar. And as you would imagine, that's something we're going to drag into this script through Unity's interface. Here though, we can say that the health bar the health bar.value is equal to whatever our health is divided by our maximum health. So currently our health bar is set up to represent a value between 0 and 1. So if our maximum health is 100 and our current health is whatever, 25, then we need that to be represented as 0.25. So we're going to need to divide it into itself. However, you may have noticed that we don't have max health currently initialized as anything. So at the start of this script, let's make max health equal to our health. So keep in mind, if you were employing a system where you were healing, maybe instead of take damage you were saying get healed, you'd also need to account for the changes in health, basically. So to check to see if this is working, let's go back into Unity, go to your player, which in this case is our FPS controller, and on the player script you'll see that there is a health bar open that has nothing in it currently. Let's drag the health bar into that and run the game and see if you lose health. There we go. Those enemies are very strong, so we may need to tune them back, but that should be okay for the moment. Okay, for the next part, we will need to jump into our game manager script. So this is a location where variables relating to things like score or the time remaining make more sense. So within update, let's make a method call to something like update UI. Now you could make a separate script to handle the UI stuff, call it maybe a UI manager of sorts, but our UI kind of isn't complex enough to really justify doing that at this point. So make a method call to update UI within update and make a private void update UI method. Now, before we get started with this, we need to make several game objects relating to the text elements that we have on screen. So here we're going to put something talking about basic UI elements. Now these are going to be public text, and we'll call it first of all enemies remaining text. We'll have another one, another public text. We'll call this time remaining text. We will have a public text that is our score text, and finally one more that is our game over text. Now, just to give these some basic elements that while the game is playing you're updating the UI with. In update UI, regarding the enemies in particular, we can say that the enemies remaining text dot text is equal to something regarding the enemies remaining. Now currently we don't have a container that's holding that information for us, so we'll also need to set that up. To do that, let's go back up the top, let's make a new public game object array called enemies. Whoop, if you can actually spell enemies. And in update, let's update that array every game loop to be enemies equals game object dot find game objects with tag, so multiple game objects with an S, and that tag is going to be enemy. So that'll fill up that array of enemies very nicely. So here we can say that our enemies.remaining text will be something like enemies remaining colon space, and now we'll put a plus sign there, followed by enemies.length. So we only care about how many enemies there are. The length of that array will give us the number of enemies within that array, because it indexes from 1 when we're talking about length, not from 0 when we're actually talking about the index. So we'll get an actual accurate value. So regarding time, or specifically the time remaining, we can set up something like it equals the time remaining in text plus a little bit of math here. That'll simply just be the max time minus the time. So if the max time we've set to be something like 50 seconds and the current time is 20, then the remaining time will be 30 seconds, right? However, this specific part here is going to be represented as a float, which is not ideal because a float has, X number of decimal places that we don't want visible within our text element. So a simple way of making this a little bit shorter is to pass it as an int, so it'll actually get displayed as a whole number without decimal places instead. So that's an elegant way of setting that up. Finally, we can set up the score to be something like score text equals score plus whatever our current score is. Not that. So it looks like we don't have a variable for score set up. So if we go to the top of our script, we should just be able to set that up easily enough. And this will be something like a public int. So we can say public int score, and by default that'll be 0. So while we have a score that we can increment, we don't currently have a system of making that go up when we kill enemies. So what we're going to need to do is go back into our enemy script, and at the line where it's dying here, we'll have to make a call to our game manager .instance.score to plus equal 1 to that score, or however many score you want. In this case I think 1 should be fine. Cool. So now, finally, when you go back into Unity, find the script attached to Game Manager. You should have a whole heap of text elements that are blank for the enemies remaining. I'm going to put enemies remaining, time remaining, score, and finally game over. Now we haven't set up the game over text yet, but we can check to see if this stuff here is working now, making sure that we are definitely calling update UI within Game Manager. If we press play now, those values should start changing. So we have 3 enemies, we have 12 seconds left, we haven't killed anything. If I just kill this thing, we now have a score of 1. Perfect. Looks like our game UI elements are working quite well. Okay, so our UI is good. However, we still don't have any of that game objective logic in place that's kind of telling us what's happening, whether we're dead, whether we've won. We have no feedback regarding that, and that's really because the game itself doesn't understand when that stuff happens. Now this is also something that we do want to put into Game Manager, and to handle this correctly, we're going to introduce a few new variables. We'll call them game elements or objectives or whatever you want. And basically this is going to come in the form of 2 booleans. The first one being a public boolean game over, and this by default is going to be false, followed by another public boolean that will be dead, followed by false. Now what I might do is actually just grab these two aspects of our game rules and put them there as well, because they both technically function as game elements as well. It makes sense to put them in that category. So to start us off with these game elements, I'm going to make a new method call, let's say before update UI. Now I'm going to call this game conditions or elements, something that makes sense like that. And this method call I'll just put under update as well, call it game conditions. I think I've got a typo there. Now, game conditions is going to be pretty straightforward. First of all, we want to check to see if the player has died, and if we're dead, make us dead and make it game over. So, all we really need to do is to see if there is a player or not, and if there isn't one, we set game over to be true, because it is game over. But we also set dead to be true. If these conditions are not met, we'll then follow it up with an else if statement that is basically talking about time. And if the time is greater than the max time, and if the enemy's dot length is equal to 0, then essentially this is the condition that is met when we've won. We're alive, we've met this objective of time being greater than max time, and we've killed all the enemies. So we've won this level, or this game in particular. So here, we just want to say game over equals true. We're not dead, but we have won. So now that we have logic in place determining if we've died or if we've won, we can go to our update UI section and make one final adjustment. That'll be the endgame text. And here, all we're going to do is check that if game over and dead are true, and if they are, we want to tell game over text to actually fill itself full of something. In this case, something like you are dead. However, if, let's take an equal sign out of that, if we have won the game, so else if game over is true and we're not dead, then we can follow this one up by saying game over text is equal to you win. Now, if we go back into the game, we press play. I might just maximize this. Press play, run into a bot, die straight away, you are dead. Cool, we know that part is working. One final thing you may want to add to this is this part of code works fine. However, if you play the game long enough, you actually start getting negative time. So we need to actually wrap this in some kind of conditional as well. In this case, we only want this to happen if the time is less than the max time. Otherwise, when it goes over max time, we start getting -1 second, -2 seconds, -3 seconds, which we don't really care about. So now when you play the game, we'll have a number of enemies spawning. We have a X amount of time that we need to survive for. I actually hope I do survive for. And we have our score going up. But what you'll notice is that every time you restart this game, the score is irrelevant. There's no high score per se. So we would ideally like to record the maximum high score that a player does achieve before they finish the game. Whether they win or lose, the number of enemies that they kill should be something that would be an ideal high score to record. So let's implement that. And this can be done relatively easily by using what's called player prefs in Unity. So we might do this in the game's condition method. We'll just add a bit of logic underneath here. We'll give it the comment updating scores, and basically all we care about is if it's game over, whether we've won or died, it doesn't matter. Simply do something with that. And here, that is going to be checking to see if the score, our current score, is greater than what's called a player prefs. Now the thing that we're going to check here is actually going to be an int. Player prefs dot get an existing int value that we are going to call high score. And if we cannot find that, by default make it 0. So if we can't find that, if it's the first instance of ever looking for this thing, or if it just simply doesn't exist, make it 0. So if it is greater than this int called high score, then we actually want to set it to be player prefs dot set int, setting that same string value, but instead of 0 here, we actually want to set it to be our score. So we're going to override whatever high score is with our new high score. And this only happens once, when we've won the game or lost. And that's it. That's basically the simplest way I can show you how to use player prefs. You just use it once to either grab some values or set some. And this can be done with literally anything, whether it be the amount of health you have, what level you are, the attachments on your player, all those kind of things can be set up using a simple player pref system, whether it be using ints, floats, or strings. So to make sure that this high score integer is working correctly, we're going to make sure it's represented in a different scene. So we're going to make a main menu and represent the new high score on that main menu, just to give players some incentive to maybe beat that high score. So I want you to go to File, New Scene, and you'll get a pretty boring looking scene that literally has nothing in it. That's great. Straight away, press Ctrl S just to save this scene and call it specifically main menu. So what you call it here is going to matter eventually, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. To make sure that this high score works correctly, let's give our main menu a UI. We'll just give it a canvas first of all. We'll call that canvas main menu, and we will scale it by screen size so that whatever we do within our screen space, it will scale correctly in our game. Still with the main menu selected, go back to Game Object, UI, Text. This will be just a title indicator of what the high score is. We'll call it high score. And let's duplicate that so that there's another one of it. We'll call this one highest score. And we'll just leave that one with an X value in it, like that. We'll grab both of these, make them central, and move them so that they're slightly better, slightly more centered on screen. Doesn't really matter where we put it, but I'm just going to drop the high score below it. Cool. Now, we're going to follow this up just to make sure our player prefs value is being used by making a new script. So this script is going to be called main menu. Open the main menu script up in Visual Studio. And first of all, I want you to add 2 libraries to this. The first one is just going to be our UI library, which we've been using already. And the second one is going to be unityengine.scene management. And this is going to allow us to switch between scenes a little bit easier. So to hold this data, I'm going to make a public text high score. So all our high score is going to do is be a high score.text equals the player pref get int high score. Same high score that we've been dealing with in the previous scene. By default, if it can't find it, it'll be 0. Now, this is going to happen. And the reason why this is going to happen is because this is expecting a string, whereas this specifically is an integer. So what we can do here, whenever you encounter instances where you're trying to feed a direct float or an int variable into a string container, is actually just attach the toString method call. So going back into Unity now, make sure you have this script attached to your main menu. You'll get a high score container that's empty. This should actually be the highest score, so don't put the high score text, put the highest score text in there. Probably should have renamed it here, but it's okay. So if you play it now, it should just come up with 0. 0. If you go to your game by navigating back to the other scene, which is FPS, if I just kill one of these things and then die, the new high score should be 1. So if we go back to our main menu now, press play, high score 1. So we know that our player prefs is working correctly. So, final thing for today is just the ability to move between scenes. Now usually you do this in game by pressing some kind of button or meeting some kind of conditions. And the idea is basically the same. You may have noticed I've just taken the liberty of making this main menu a little bit more interesting. Feel free to do that yourself. I'm not really going to spend too much time on it. So, the way we're going to show you how to do this is by using a button. So, just with the main menu selected, go to Game Object UI Button, and let's rename that button to something that makes sense, maybe Start. And you'll need to redo the text of that as well. So let's move this Start button to somewhere over here. Now the important thing that you need to know with the Start button is that it uses what's called an on-click event, and this is represented here in the bottom right of the button script component. Now this is a little bit confusing because what you need to do here is press this plus sign, and it wants a game object to be dropped here. In this case, that game object is going to be main menu, because main menu is going to have the script that we're going to have a method call associated with loading a new scene. So here, make a public void load scene, and we're going to give this method a parameter that is a string called level name. And all this is going to do is talk to scene manager. It's specifically going to ask it to load a scene, and that scene's name is going to be level name. And that's it. If you go back into Unity, assuming you again have the main menu dragged into here, and the main menu has this script on it, the Start button will allow you to first of all talk about the main menu game object, but more specifically talk about the methods that are attached on that script. In this case, load scene. The scene that we want to load is called FPS, as in the first scene that we've been working on. This one. So Start button, on-click event, main menu game object dragged into here that has the main menu script on it, that allows you to talk to the method calls within that script One of them being a public load scene script that has a FPS string parameter. But before you can even do that, we need to do one more thing. And that is making these scenes available to the game. To do that, we go to Build Settings from File and just drag in both the main menu and the FPS scenes. So this will allow you to actually call these scenes from wherever you are in the game. That's just the name that they've been given. So as long as the name matches up here, and this is why I was talking specifically about naming your main menu, something that makes sense, it'll just work. So now, if we play our game, if we press start, we should load the FPS scene. And there you go. If I now maybe get a score of at least 2 and then die, if I just restart our game again, you'll notice that if I play now, high score of 2. So really this is the basics of scene management. There's a lot more that you could do here, and tying in elements of the UI is very important with that system. For example, if I just press play and wanted to have a pause menu, I don't have one set up right now, but it would be a simple case of adding UI elements that get activated when you press a key. Maybe you actually do want to pause the game specifically so that we don't actually have to keep fighting the robots the whole time. You may want to have a button show up when you die, for instance, that allows you to restart the scene. Or, if you win, progress back to the main menu or to the next level or whatever. I'll allow you to figure that out for yourself. You may have one or more levels planned for this, or you may have your own interesting setup to do with either a survival horde shooter or some other kind of FPS game that you have in mind. Again, take this time to talk to your tutors. They can help you implement what you have in mind. They are a great resource for getting all kinds of different mechanics working in your games. Otherwise, this is the last tutorial for the FPS game. Next week we'll be moving on to side-scroller territory.